In 1911, a fire broke out on the upper floors of a factory building in New York City. It was not an unusual event in an industrial workplace of that era. What made this fire different was not how it started, but how the building responded to it. Within minutes, hundreds of workers found themselves trapped above the flames, with exits locked, stairwells blocked, and no safe way down. As smoke filled the rooms and heat intensified, the factory's safety measures failed one by one. When the fire was finally extinguished, it had left behind more than destruction. It exposed working conditions that had been accepted as normal, and it forced a city and a nation to confront the cost of ignoring them. Before the fire, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was a typical example of early 20th century industrial work in New York City. Located on the upper floors of the Ash Building, near Washington Square, the factory produced women's blouses known as shirtwaists, a popular garment at the time. The building itself was considered modern and fire-resistant, constructed with steel framing and designed to reassure both owners and inspectors that it was safe. Inside, however, the factory floors were crowded and tightly organized for efficiency rather than safety. Rows of sewing machines filled the rooms, leaving narrow aisles between workstations. Fabric scraps accumulated on the wooden floors and work tables, creating a constant presence of flammable material. Most of the workers were young immigrant women, many in their teens or early 20s, who stood or sat at their machines for long hours each day. The pace of work was fast, and supervision was strict. Doors were kept locked during working hours to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks. Fire drills were rare, and safety training was minimal or non-existent. The fire escape attached to the building was narrow and poorly maintained, more symbolic than functional. Despite these conditions, the factory operated openly and legally. Inspections focused largely on the building's structure rather than the realities of daily work inside it. The factory had passed previous safety checks, reinforcing the belief that it met acceptable standards. For the workers, these conditions were simply part of normal life. Crowded floors, locked exits, and long hours were common across the garment industry. Few questioned whether the system could protect them in an emergency. The building appeared solid, the work routine familiar, and the risks abstract. On the afternoon of March 25, 1911, the factory was operating as it always had. Nothing about the day suggested that it would end differently from any other. Yet beneath the appearance of normality, the conditions for disaster were already in place, built into the layout of the factory, the practices of management, and the assumptions that had gone unchallenged for years. Fire was a constant risk in garment factories at the beginning of the 20th century, yet it was treated as an unavoidable inconvenience rather than a serious threat. Inside the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, flammable materials were everywhere. Cotton fabric, tissue paper used for patterns, and wooden work tables filled the rooms. Waste bins overflowed with scraps that were rarely cleared during the workday. Smoking was officially prohibited, but enforcement was inconsistent, and matches were common tools in daily life. Despite this, little was done to prepare for the possibility of a fire. There were no automatic sprinkler systems installed on the factory floors, even though such systems already existed and had proven effective elsewhere. Fire buckets and hoses were limited and poorly positioned. Exit routes were narrow, poorly marked, and in some cases deliberately obstructed. One of the stairwell doors was routinely locked during working hours, a management practice intended to control workers rather than protect them. The fire escape, meant to serve as a last resort, was fragile and inadequately anchored to the building. Its design had not been tested under emergency conditions, and its capacity was never seriously questioned. City fire codes at the time were inconsistent and weakly enforced, especially in older buildings that had been repurposed for industrial use. Responsibility for safety was divided between building owners, factory managers, and city inspectors, creating gaps where no one felt fully accountable. Inspections, when they occurred, focused on visible compliance rather than realistic emergency scenarios. As long as a building met the letter of existing regulations, deeper risks were often ignored. For factory owners, Production efficiency and cost control took priority. For inspectors, limited authority and heavy workloads reduced scrutiny. For workers, there was little power to demand change. The result was an environment in which danger became normalized. Fire was understood as something that happened elsewhere, to other factories, on other days. The absence of previous incidents at Triangle reinforced this belief. Each uneventful workday strengthened the assumption that the system, however imperfect, was sufficient. In reality, the factory's safety measures were not designed to handle a fast-moving fire on the upper floors of a crowded building. They were designed to appear adequate, not to function under pressure. By the time the afternoon of March 25th reached its final hour, the risks embedded in the factory's layout and policies were no longer abstract. They were waiting for a single spark. Shortly before the end of the workday, on March 25, 1911, a fire broke out on the 8th floor of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. The exact cause was never definitively determined, but it was widely believed to have started when a discarded cigarette or match ignited fabric scraps beneath a work table. Within moments, the fire spread rapidly. The factory floor was filled with flammable materials, and the open layout allowed flames to move unchecked. Workers nearest the fire attempted to extinguish it using buckets of water, but the effort failed almost immediately. The fire grew too quickly. As smoke thickened and heat intensified, panic spread across the floor. Some workers rushed toward the stairwells, only to find that one of the exit doors was locked. Others turned toward the fire escape, which began to bend and buckle under the sudden weight of people trying to flee. On the upper floors, the situation became even more desperate. The building's elevators made a limited number of trips before becoming unusable, and the narrow staircases quickly filled with smoke. Firefighters arriving on the street below were unable to reach the upper floors with their ladders, which extended only partway up the building. As the fire advanced, workers were forced toward the windows, searching for air and any possible escape. The fire moved faster than the building's safety measures could respond, exposing how unprepared the factory was for an emergency of this scale. What unfolded over the next few minutes was chaotic and devastating. The fire did not last long, but its effects were immediate and irreversible. In a matter of minutes, the conditions that had been normalized inside the factory were exposed as lethal. The layout, the locked doors, the inadequate fire escape, and the absence of effective suppression systems converged into a single failure. The fire itself was not extraordinary. What made it catastrophic was the environment in which it burned. As the fire was brought under control, the scale of the tragedy became visible on the streets below the factory. Crowds gathered quickly, drawn by smoke, sirens, and the shock of what had unfolded above them. Firefighters and police worked to secure the building and recover those trapped inside, but there was little they could do to change what had already happened. The fire itself had been extinguished in less than half an hour, yet its consequences filled the surrounding blocks for hours. Bodies lay on the sidewalks and in the interior courtyard, covered and counted as officials tried to understand the scope of the loss. Survivors were taken to nearby hospitals, many suffering from burns, smoke inhalation, or injuries sustained during escape attempts. The Ash Building, which had been considered fireproof, now stood as a stark contradiction to that belief. News of the fire spread rapidly through New York City. Newspapers printed detailed accounts and photographs, and by the next morning, the disaster dominated public attention. For many residents, this was the first time the realities of factory work were so visibly exposed. The victims were identified as young workers, many of them recent immigrants, whose names and ages filled long lists in the press. Families gathered outside morgues and hospitals, searching for relatives who had not returned home. What had begun as an ordinary workday ended as a public reckoning. The fire was no longer just an industrial accident. It had become a shared trauma for the city, raising urgent questions about workplace safety, responsibility, and how such conditions had been allowed to exist in plain sight. In the days following the fire, attention turned from the scene of the disaster to the systems that had allowed it to happen. Investigators examined the factory layout, exit routes, and safety equipment, reconstructing the final moments on each floor. Testimony from survivors confirmed what many had already suspected. Exit doors had been locked. Fire escapes had failed. Warnings had gone unheeded. City officials launched formal inquiries, while public outrage intensified. Labor unions, reformers, and journalists demanded accountability, arguing that the fire was not an unavoidable tragedy, but the result of neglect and exploitation. Factory owners Isaac Harris and Max Blank were charged with manslaughter, accused of knowingly maintaining unsafe conditions. During the trial, the focus narrowed to a single question. Did the owners know that the doors were locked during working hours? The prosecution presented witness testimony describing routine practices, while the defense challenged credibility and emphasized legal technicalities. In the end, the jury acquitted the owners, concluding that there was insufficient proof they had direct knowledge of the locked doors at the moment of the fire. The verdict shocked many and deepened public anger. Though cleared of criminal responsibility, the owners later faced civil lawsuits and were ordered to pay compensation to victims' families. The sums were modest, reinforcing the sense that justice had fallen short. At the same time, the investigations revealed broader failures beyond individual guilt. Inspectors, regulators, and lawmakers had all operated within systems that prioritized compliance over safety. The trial closed one chapter of the tragedy, but it left unresolved questions about how responsibility should be defined when harm is produced by accepted practices rather than deliberate acts. Although the criminal trial ended without convictions, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire triggered a response that extended far beyond the courtroom. Public pressure did not fade after the verdict. Instead, it intensified, shifting focus from individual blame to systemic reform. New York State established the Factory Investigating Commission, tasked with examining working conditions across hundreds of factories. The commission conducted detailed inspections, interviewed workers, and documented hazards that had long been ignored. What they found echoed the conditions at Triangle. Locked exits, inadequate fire escapes, overcrowded floors, and poor ventilation were common throughout the garment industry. These findings transformed the fire from a singular tragedy into evidence of a widespread problem. Lawmakers could no longer argue that existing regulations were sufficient. Over the next several years, New York enacted dozens of new labor and safety laws. These reforms addressed fire prevention, building exits, maximum occupancy, sanitation, and working hours. Sprinkler systems became mandatory in many buildings, and regular inspections were strengthened. Responsibility for enforcement was clarified, reducing the gaps that had previously allowed unsafe practices to persist. The impact of these changes extended beyond New York. Other states began to adopt similar regulations, using the Triangle Fire as a reference point. The disaster reshaped how industrial safety was understood in the United States. It demonstrated that voluntary compliance and minimal standards were not enough to protect workers. Safety had to be enforced, measured, and revisited continuously. While these reforms could not undo the loss of life, they marked a turning point. The fire forced institutions to acknowledge that industrial growth carried obligations as well as profits, and that ignoring working conditions came with consequences that could no longer be dismissed as unfortunate accidents. More than a century later, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire remains a defining moment in the history of industrial labor and workplace safety. It is remembered not only for the number of lives lost, but for what it revealed about how danger becomes normalized. The factory did not operate outside the law. Its conditions were common, its practices widely accepted, and its risks largely ignored until they could no longer be denied. The fire exposed the cost of treating safety as secondary to efficiency and control. It showed how systems designed to maximize production can quietly strip away protections, one small compromise at a time. The changes that followed reshaped labor laws and saved countless lives, yet the questions raised by the disaster remain relevant. How much risk is considered acceptable in the pursuit of productivity? Who is responsible, when harm results from practices everyone has come to accept. The legacy of the Triangle Fire lies in this tension. It serves as a reminder that progress without accountability carries hidden costs, and that the absence of immediate consequences does not mean a system is safe. The factory floors have long since fallen silent, but the lessons forged in that fire continue to shape how work, responsibility, and human life are valued.